In the waning light of the 14th century, as Europe staggered beneath the weight of war, plague, and religious schism, a small but determined kingdom on the western edge of the continent began to stir with imperial ambition. Portugal, long overshadowed by its larger neighbors and pressed between the sea and Castile, had begun to reimagine its place in the world. It was here, in this charged atmosphere of anxiety and possibility, that a boy was born, one who would come to redefine the map of the known world without ever stepping foot upon its farthest shores. Henry was born in 1394 in the city of Porto, the third surviving son of King John I of Portugal and Philippa of Lancaster, an English princess whose lineage traced back to Edward III. His birth came during a moment of profound transformation for the Portuguese crown. Just a few years earlier, in 1383, the country had been plunged into a dynastic crisis that threatened to dismantle its sovereignty altogether. The death of King Ferdinand I without a male heir had triggered a succession dispute, one which saw Portugal on the brink of falling under the dominion of Castile. It was only through the decisive military victory at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, where John, Master of Avis, led a nationalist uprising to claim the throne, that the kingdom retained its independence. This newly crowned King John I, Henry's father, was a monarch forged by rebellion, a ruler whose authority was earned through battle and legitimized through a union with England. The Avis dynasty was born from crisis, and it would be defined by ambition. Into this crucible of war, uncertainty, and emerging national pride, Henry arrived. Unlike many royal children of the time, he was not destined for the throne. That burden would fall to his older brother Duarte, later King Edward. This lack of direct succession, however, did not relegate Henry to irrelevance. Instead, it afforded him a unique freedom. He would not inherit the kingdom, but he could shape its future. From a young age, he was drawn not to the courtly intrigues of Lisbon, but to the more enduring mysteries of the sea. While other princes hunted in forests or sparred in the training yards, Henry stood on the cliffs of Sagres, gazing westward into the endless Atlantic, imagining worlds not yet discovered. But before he could chase his vision, Henry would have to earn his reputation on the battlefield. In the early 15th century, Christendom was engaged in a bitter struggle for dominance across the Mediterranean and North Africa. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign by Iberian Christians to reclaim territory from Muslim rulers, was not just a political or territorial movement, but a spiritual and cultural one. For young nobles like Henry, the struggle was imbued with divine purpose, framed as both a defense of the faith and a gateway to glory. It was in this context that he found his first great opportunity, the planned expedition to capture the Moroccan city of Ceuta. Ceuta, a thriving port at the entrance to the Mediterranean, was a rich and strategic prize. A hub of trade routes linking Africa with Europe and the East, it was also seen as a gateway to the fabled gold and spice riches of the interior. More than that, it was a Muslim city, and thus a target ripe for holy conquest. In 1415, when Henry was just 21, he joined his father and brothers in the military campaign to seize it. The preparation for the assault on Ceuta was monumental. Thousands of troops were assembled. Ships were loaded with weapons, provisions, and religious banners bearing the cross of Christ. It was the first major overseas operation of the Portuguese crown, and it was to be a declaration to the world that Portugal would no longer be confined to its borders. Henry, though not the supreme commander, played a crucial role in organizing the fleet and leading men into battle. His courage and strategic insight quickly distinguished him among the nobility. When the Portuguese finally landed on the shores of Ceuta in August of that year, they found the city ill-prepared for the ferocity of their assault. The fighting was brutal but brief. Within hours, the defenders crumbled and the city fell. Henry entered Ceuta not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of a new Portugal, expansionist, crusading, and hungry for influence. For his valor, he earned admiration at court and among the people, but more importantly, he caught a glimpse of the larger world that lay beyond. What he saw in Ceuta changed him. The city, though conquered, was not broken. Its streets bustled with traders from as far as Timbuktu and Cairo, speaking languages he could not understand, trading in goods he had never imagined. The whispers of gold mines in the African interior, of exotic spices and fabrics, of routes stretching deep into lands unknown to Europeans, these tales ignited something in him that no battlefield ever could. He began to understand that the future of Portugal would not be forged solely by sword and shield, but by wind and sail. Returning home, Henry found himself possessed by a singular vision: to push the boundaries of the known world, to map the edges of the earth, and to bring the wealth of distant lands into the coffers of Lisbon. Yet the path to exploration was far from straightforward. The ocean was vast and terrifying. Myths of sea monsters, boiling waters, and the edge of the world persisted. Sailors feared venturing too far south, beyond a point known as Cape Ojader, where it was said no man returned. The Mediterranean was well charted, but the Atlantic remained a dark expanse of uncertainty. It was here, on the edge of that darkness, that Henry would stake his claim. Rather than returning to the royal court to bask in his military triumph, he withdrew to the southern tip of Portugal, to the rocky promontory of Sagres. There, facing the sea, he would begin his life's work, not as a navigator in the literal sense, but as a visionary who would gather the tools, people, and knowledge necessary to unlock the secrets of the ocean. Henry was methodical. He collected maps, charts, and navigational texts from across Europe and the Islamic world. He brought together astronomers, cartographers, shipbuilders, and seamen, creating what many have called the first modern research institute. The so-called School of Sagres became a beacon for intellectual and technological advancement, a place where the limitations of medieval navigation were gradually overcome through innovation and collaboration. The magnetic compass, the astrolabe, the development of the caravel, these were not Henry's inventions, but under his patronage, they were refined and deployed with unprecedented precision. Yet Henry's ambition was not purely scientific. His motives were deeply entwined with his religious faith. As a devout Christian and a member of the Order of Christ, the successor to the Templars in Portugal, he saw exploration as a form of evangelism. The conversion of heathen lands, the expansion of Christendom, and the confrontation with Islam were as central to his mission as the search for gold or spices. In his mind, the sea was not a barrier, but a path, one that led not only to material riches but to spiritual conquest. As the 1420s dawned, Henry began dispatching ships southward along the West African coast. Each voyage pushed the boundaries a little further. Each return brought new knowledge of currents, wind patterns, coastal features, and native peoples. Most of these expeditions were modest, their results incremental, but they represented a radical shift in European thinking. No longer was the ocean a place of terror and legend. It was becoming a domain of exploration, of possibility. At court, however, not everyone shared Henry's enthusiasm. Critics viewed his endeavors as costly distractions. The returns were uncertain, the risks high. There were no great conquests, no spectacular treasures. But Henry pressed on, personally funding many of the voyages and shielding his captains from political backlash. He was building not an empire of territories, but an empire of knowledge, a foundation upon which future generations would build. By the time he reached his 30s, Henry had become an enigmatic figure. Neither fully courtier nor explorer, he occupied a liminal space between the known and the unknown. His mind was filled with maps of uncharted coasts, of trade winds and stellar alignments. He spoke of Prester John, of river routes to India, of alliances with mythical Christian kings beyond the desert. To some, he was a dreamer. To others, a fanatic. But to those who sailed under his banner, he was the guiding star. As the sun set on the first half of the 15th century, Portugal stood at the edge of transformation. The seeds of empire had been sown, not in the bloodied streets of Ceuta alone, but in the wind-whipped cliffs of Sagres, where a prince without a crown had dared to imagine a world without limits. Henry had not yet reached the height of his influence, nor seen the full fruits of his labor. But the compass had been set, the course begun. In time, the world itself would shift beneath the wake of Portuguese sails, and it would all trace back to that moment when a young man chose the sea over the throne. Far from the polished marble halls of Lisbon and the weighty deliberations of the royal court, Henry the Navigator withdrew to the wild and wind-blown cliffs of the Algarve. In a place where the land gave way to endless ocean, he began constructing what would become his true kingdom, not one of castles and coinage, but of knowledge, vision, and audacity. It was not a fortress in the traditional sense, though battlements were built, but a bastion of minds and maps, of instruments and speculation, where the limits of the known world would be methodically challenged by a man who had never sailed beyond the horizon himself. Sagres was not much to look at in those early days. A barren promontory exposed to harsh winds and ceaseless Atlantic spray, it was the last outcropping of Europe before the world dissolved into maritime mystery. But for Henry, its isolation was precisely what made it sacred. Here, away from the distractions of courtly life and political infighting, he could nurture an idea that was more radical than any conquest, that the world was navigable, and that destiny lay not inland, but outward. The sun dipped into the sea every evening, and Henry watched it fall with a heart burning to know what lay beyond. It was at Sagres that Henry began to gather the fragments of human knowledge scattered across centuries and civilizations. He summoned Jewish astronomers from Lisbon, Muslim navigators from captured Ceuta, Christian scholars from the universities of Coimbra and Salamanca. The intellectual tensions of medieval Europe were momentarily suspended within his halls, where science, faith, and ambition intersected. He sought not debate, but synthesis and understanding of the heavens and the sea that could be applied to the ships that launched from nearby Lagos and Lagos Bay. The tools of this new endeavor were many. The quadrant and astrolabe, ancient in origin but recently refined, were adapted for maritime use, allowing sailors to gauge latitude by measuring the angle of celestial bodies. The magnetic compass, long used by Arab and Chinese navigators, became a mainstay of Portuguese expeditions. But Henry's greatest contribution was the caravel. Smaller and faster than traditional ships, it was agile enough to tack against the wind and strong enough to withstand oceanic storms. With its lateen sails and reinforced hull, the caravel became the vessel through which Europe would exit the medieval age and enter modernity. Henry's role in all of this was not that of a scientist or a shipbuilder, but of a catalyst. He did not invent the caravel nor chart the stars, but he created the conditions in which such advancements could be harnessed toward a singular purpose: exploration. He invested his own wealth into these efforts, leveraging his titles as Duke of Viseu and Grand Master of the Order of Christ to secure funding and legitimacy. His name, already respected from the conquest of Ceuta, became synonymous with curiosity and courage, even among those who doubted his methods. But it was not enough to dream of the sea, one had to send men into it. And so Henry began commissioning voyages southward along the coast of Africa, each one venturing slightly farther than the last. These early journeys were humble in scale but monumental in meaning. The Cape of Bojador, long believed to be the edge of the world, became Henry's first symbolic target. For generations, sailors had refused to sail beyond it, convinced that boiling seas, magnetic anomalies, or monstrous creatures awaited them. It was a boundary not just of geography, but of fear. In 1434, one of Henry's captains, Gil Eanes, finally breached it. The return of his ship, intact and unscathed, sent shockwaves through the maritime world. There were no demons beyond Bojador, no chasms into which ships fell. Just more coast, more sea, more wind. The psychological barrier shattered, and with it, the scope of Portuguese ambition expanded dramatically. Henry had proven that the unknown was not unknowable. With each new voyage, the coastline of Africa was etched into Portuguese charts. The Canary Islands, the Madeira Archipelago, and the Azores, previously mythic or poorly understood, were explored, mapped, and in some cases colonized. These islands became critical waypoints for future voyages, providing fresh water, provisions, and strategic naval positions. They also became testing grounds for agricultural models that would later be exported to the Americas, sugarcane plantations fueled by enslaved labor. As the expeditions continued, they brought back more than just geographic knowledge. Reports filtered in of rivers that ran inland, of cities far beyond the dunes, of black-skinned peoples who bartered gold, ivory, and even humans. Henry began to envision not only exploration but commerce. Trade with Africa, especially for gold and slaves, could fill the coffers of Portugal and fund even greater expeditions. Thus began the delicate and often brutal intertwining of exploration and exploitation, a dual legacy that would stain every subsequent empire. But in the 1440s, this vision was still embryonic. The men Henry sent out were venturing into unfamiliar territories in primitive vessels guided only by stars and prayer. Many did not return. Storms, shipwrecks, and hostile encounters with local populations took a heavy toll. Yet Henry was undeterred. He cataloged each failure, learned from every disaster, and adjusted his strategy accordingly. In time, his captains grew bolder and more skilled. Names like Dinis Diaz, Nuno Tristeo, and Alvaro Fernandez became known for their daring, each one pushing farther south toward the equator and beyond. At home, Henry's reputation evolved. He was admired for his persistence, respected for his intellect, but also viewed with suspicion. His projects were expensive, and the rewards were often intangible. While the king and his ministers concerned themselves with tax revenue and foreign alliances, Henry spent hours discussing wind currents and lunar phases. He spoke of the antipodes of Prester John, of a mythical Christian kingdom hidden deep within the African interior that could serve as an ally against Islam. He believed that knowledge was a weapon, and that maps could be more powerful than swords. To maintain momentum, Henry needed more than personal wealth. He secured papal support, appealing to Pope Eugenius IV to grant Portugal exclusive rights over territories discovered south of Cape Bojador. The Pope's subsequent bull conferred divine legitimacy on Henry's ventures and framed them as part of a holy mission. It was not merely expansion, it was evangelism, conquest in the name of Christ. This framing would have enormous consequences, shaping the ideology of European imperialism for centuries. Sagres, once a backwater, became a bustling hub of maritime activity. Sailors trained in its waters. Cartographers traced new contours onto their parchments. The scent of pitch and salt filled the air. Foreign envoys visited, intrigued by the flurry of activity and innovation. And all of it centered on one man who watched the horizon with relentless fixation, measuring not only the movement of ships but the movement of history itself. Henry's relationship with the sea was not romantic. He did not dream of freedom or poetic adventure. To him, the ocean was a problem to be solved, a space to be mastered, a domain to be brought under Christian and Portuguese control. His vision was imperial, spiritual, and methodical. It was also deeply personal. He had no wife, no children. His devotion to exploration was total. Some said he was ascetic, even cold. Others saw him as fanatical. But no one doubted his resolve. As the 1450s approached, Henry's efforts began to bear more tangible fruit. Portuguese ships returned with small quantities of gold dust, a sign that the interior might be rich indeed. More controversially, they also brought African captives, men, women, and children who would be sold in the markets of Lisbon. The moral implications of this practice were not lost on Henry's contemporaries. But in a world shaped by hierarchy, war, and conquest, slavery was seen not as aberration but as opportunity. The beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade, one of history's darkest enterprises, had been set in motion. But Henry's focus remained fixed on the larger goal, finding a sea route to the fabled riches of the East. He believed that Africa could be rounded, that beyond its western bulge lay a passage to India, to the Spice Islands, to Cathay. It was a belief that defied conventional wisdom and contemporary maps, but one that would eventually prove true. His calculations, though crude by modern standards, were guided by logic, astronomy, and the slowly growing accumulation of data from his expeditions. He would not live to see it completed. But he knew, as he stood on the cliffs of Sagres with the wind in his hair and charts in his hand, that history was beginning to shift. The world was being measured, mapped, understood. And it was being changed, not by kings or armies, but by ships, compasses, and the insatiable curiosity of a prince who dared to ask what lay beyond the edge. The fortress he built at Sagres would one day fall into ruin. The men he trained would be forgotten by all but the most diligent historians. The maps he commissioned would be surpassed, corrected, and redrawn. But the spirit he unleashed, that hunger to know, to reach, to conquer the unknown, would define not only Portugal but the entire age to come. He had turned his back on the throne, and in doing so had turned his face to the world. As the mid-15th century dawned over the Atlantic, Portugal stood on the cusp of something unprecedented. The edges of the map had begun to blur and dissolve under the weight of empirical observation, no longer confined to myth, hearsay, or the ancient scribblings of Ptolemy. The contours of the African coastline were being revealed mile by mile, inch by inch, through salt-stung eyes and blistered hands. Behind every ship launched southward from the ports of Lagos and Sagres stood the same silent force, Henry the Navigator. Though his feet remained planted on the soil of Europe, His mind roamed far beyond, following the course of every wave, every gust, every current that led his captains farther into the unknown. The voyages intensified. Each mission was built upon the notes and failures of the last. Henry's system was not one of reckless ambition, but of calculated persistence. He studied weather patterns and lunar cycles. He pored over the charts his scribes and cartographers produced from sailors' logs. He maintained a growing archive of observations, depths, latitudes, tides, prevailing winds, creating a corpus of knowledge that, for its time, was unparalleled in Europe. It was not merely a maritime strategy. It was a slow but deliberate construction of certainty over chaos. It became clear that this was no longer a personal obsession but a national endeavor. The crown began to take interest not just in the voyages themselves but in the possibilities they suggested. Lisbon's merchants, ever watchful of their Genoese and Venetian rivals, saw opportunity in the foreign spices and gold rumored to be waiting beyond the deserts. The clergy saw a chance to fulfill their ancient fantasy of spreading Christendom deep into Africa and perhaps discovering the fabled kingdom of Prester John. And the nobility, drawn by dreams of conquest and titles, began to view exploration as a path not only to wealth but to relevance in a rapidly evolving political landscape. But progress remained agonizingly slow. The African coastline, vast and sinuous, offered few easy landfalls and even fewer friendly faces. The peoples encountered were alien in language, appearance, and custom. Some traded willingly, curious about the strange white-sailed visitors who offered bells, cloth, and trinkets. Others resisted fiercely, wielding poisoned arrows and jeers in equal measure. And the sea itself remained an unforgiving judge. Many ships vanished, swallowed without a trace, claimed by uncharted reefs or tempests that blew without warning. Every captain who returned was treated like a survivor of war, part hero, part ghost. Still, the map grew. It was Henry's true monument, an ever-evolving manuscript that captured not only the world's geography but the shifting ambitions of an entire people. His cartographers etched new coastlines onto parchment, added river mouths, sketched in mountain ranges glimpsed through mist. Place names emerged in a mixture of Portuguese, Arabic, and local dialects, forming a linguistic mosaic that mirrored the complexity of the undertaking. These maps were guarded fiercely, considered state secrets. Knowledge, Henry understood, was the most valuable cargo of all. Among the most daring of his captains was Nuno Tristeo, who pushed into the mouth of the Senegal River and encountered the first of the great West African trading networks. His voyages revealed not only navigable rivers and complex polities, but signs of wealth, gold dust traded in leather pouches, ivory carved with astonishing skill. Tristeo's discoveries fed the growing appetite in Lisbon for African trade, even as his expeditions exposed the inherent dangers of European arrogance in foreign lands. On one of his later journeys, Tristeo and his crew were ambushed by local warriors and killed. Their ships seized, their weapons and goods distributed among victors who viewed them not as emissaries of a superior civilization, but as intruders to be expelled. The death of Tristeo was a personal blow to Henry. It was not the first loss, nor would it be the last, but it confirmed what he already knew, that exploration was a wager with fate, and the stakes were measured in human lives. Still, he refused to halt the momentum. Every setback, every fatal mistake, every shipwreck became part of a growing reservoir of experience. It was an era when the lives of men were the currency spent in pursuit of understanding, and Henry spent them with the cold precision of a general. In 1444, a new milestone was reached. A fleet under the command of Lancarote de Freitas sailed as far south as the coast of modern-day Mauritania, where it encountered a village of Berber-speaking people. The Portuguese attacked, capturing over 200 individuals and transporting them back to Portugal, where they were sold as slaves. This was not the first instance of human trafficking in Portuguese history, but it marked a grim turning point, the formalization of the slave trade as a byproduct of exploration. Henry did not shrink from this outcome. In fact, he justified it publicly, describing the captives as pagans who would now be exposed to Christianity. To him, this was not exploitation but salvation. It was a rationalization that would be echoed by generations of colonizers across continents and centuries. The implications were vast. The voyages no longer promised only cartographic rewards, but economic ones. Gold and ivory were valuable, but human bodies offered a different kind of profit, one that required no mining, no planting, no forging. This revelation catalyzed an increase in exploratory efforts, especially among those who sought not knowledge but wealth. Henry, once mocked for pouring funds into what seemed like folly, now found himself at the center of a movement that fused commerce, conquest, and theology into a single engine of expansion. And yet, his vision remained more expansive than those of the merchants and slave traders who followed in his wake. Henry still believed that the coastlines were merely the preamble to a greater chapter. His thoughts turned increasingly toward the Indian Ocean, where spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon were traded in quantities that made European economies seem provincial. He theorized that if Africa could be circumnavigated, Portugal could reach India by sea, bypassing the Islamic middlemen who controlled the overland routes. This was the holy grail of navigation. A dream as bold as it was improbable. To support this ambition, Henry intensified his efforts to gather intelligence. He sent envoys into the courts of Muslim North Africa to collect rumors. He interrogated the maps brought by Italian traders. He even encouraged the translation of Arabic geographical texts, looking for clues hidden in the writings of scholars who had long studied the regions Europe knew only as shadows. It was a search not for gold or land, but for a route, a corridor through which Portugal might pass to touch the riches of the East. Back at Sagres, the school of navigation, never officially established, but very real in practice, grew in reputation. Young nobles and seasoned sailors alike came to study under Henry's patronage. They practiced celestial navigation, learned to read maps, memorized the currents and winds of the Atlantic. It was an education not rooted in tradition, but in experimentation. They were being trained not just to sail, but to see beyond the superstitions and limits of their age, to imagine a world in which the sea was not an enemy but a path. By the early 1450s, Henry's name had become synonymous with exploration. Foreign monarchs sent letters of inquiry. Scholars wrote treatises citing his work. Popes issued bulls granting him authority over lands not yet discovered. And still he remained at Sagres, removed from the spotlight, guiding the course of history from the edge of the continent. His hair had begun to gray. His hands trembled slightly when he traced maps, but his mind was as sharp and restless as ever. He rarely visited Lisbon now. The capital had grown impatient with his lofty ideas, preferring the immediate returns of trade and conquest. But Henry had never been interested in what was easy or near. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the next discovery, the next possibility. He was not content to have reached the Senegal River or to have mapped the Azores. He wanted to unlock the full shape of the world, to discover its rhythm and logic, to place Portugal not just on the map, but at the center of it. His ambitions were not just national, but civilizational. He believed that Europe stood at the threshold of a new epoch, one in which the shackles of ignorance would be cast off and the globe rendered legible. In his journals and letters, he wrote of a world brought into unity through trade and faith, where distant peoples would come to know one another not through war, but through connection. It was a vision marked by idealism, but also by blindness to the cost, to the violence, to the erasure that such unity would require. And so Henry continued. He reviewed ship designs, listened to weather reports, studied foreign scripts. He debated strategy with his navigators, mapped possible courses around Africa, calculated the months and provisions required to reach India. Each day brought new rumors of inland empires rich in gold, of rivers that ran east, of men who spoke Greek or Coptic far from the Mediterranean. Each rumor was a spark, fueling the fire that burned in him still. In the quiet hours before dawn, he would walk alone along the cliffs of Sagres, listening to the sea. He would look up at the stars that guided his captains, and he would trace in his mind the lines of latitude that now seemed less abstract, more tangible, drawn into being by the courage of men he had sent into peril. The wind bit at his cloak. The waves roared below, but he stood firm. For Henry, this was not solitude. It was command. He had not yet reached his destination, but he had changed the direction of the wind. By the time Henry reached his 6th decade, the map he had once studied as a youth had changed irreversibly. What was once a void beyond the Pillars of Hercules had become a coast, a trail of names, rivers, and promontories stretching like a tentative thread along the edge of Africa. The unknown was no longer a place of monsters and legends. It had become a frontier of enterprise. And for Henry, the triad that now drove this expansion, Gold, God, and glory was not a cynical calculation, but the culmination of everything he believed about Portugal's destiny. Reports from his navigators filtered back to Sagres and Lisbon with increasing frequency. The Senegal River was no longer a mystery, its course was being traced. And the peoples along its banks, Mandinka, Wolof, Fulani, were being studied, categorized, and negotiated with. Some of these peoples traded willingly, offering gold dust, ivory, and even captives taken from rival tribes. Others resisted, provoking violent clashes. Each interaction, whether peaceful or bloody, deepened the Portuguese understanding of the continent and expanded the kingdom's influence. But it was the gold that set Lisbon alight, the precious metal. Portugal had access to an independent source of gold, one not filtered through Italian bankers or Arab merchants. The implications were vast. Credit expanded. Trade flourished. Lisbon's docks, once sleepy and provincial, now bristled with ships unloading goods from strange and distant shores. Henry saw this not only as vindication but as preparation. The wealth gained from Africa was to be reinvested, not squandered in courtly excess, but directed toward the greater goal, opening a sea route to the east. His conviction remained unshaken that if the African continent could be rounded, the Indian Ocean and its spice empires would be within reach. And yet, for all his growing prestige, he faced mounting criticism. Some members of the royal court questioned the cost of his ventures, the human toll, the strategic value of distant coastlines inhabited by unfamiliar tribes. Others accused him of harboring unrealistic fantasies, driven more by theological ambition than geopolitical logic. To Henry, such criticisms were the product of small minds. He viewed the age of discovery not as a pragmatic endeavor but as a moral and civilizational mission. The Portuguese, he believed, had been chosen by Providence to illuminate the world, to bring Christianity to pagan shores, to uplift and transform. His writings were filled with references to divine guidance, to biblical prophecy, to the notion that exploration was a form of redemption. Each newly discovered land, each newly baptized soul, was a confirmation that God's hand was on the helm of Portuguese ships. But not all confirmations were spiritual. By the late 1440s, Henry had turned his attention toward more aggressive commercial ventures. He began granting licenses to private captains and consortia, allowing them to explore and trade under his aegis in exchange for a portion of their profits. These contracts, known as capitulations, were early prototypes of what would later become the charter systems of imperial companies. They allowed Portugal to expand its maritime reach without bearing the full cost of each expedition. And they attracted a new breed of adventurer, men who sailed not out of loyalty or faith, but for wealth and renown. It was during this period that the slave trade, once an incidental byproduct of exploration, began to crystallize into a system. The captives brought back from West Africa were no longer viewed solely as curiosities or trophies. They were commodities. Markets were established. Auctions held. The city of Lagos became an early hub of slave traffic, where Africans were sold into households, fields, and galleys. Henry, far from distancing himself from the practice, provided theological justification. He argued that conversion through captivity was a path to salvation and that the Africans, by entering Christian society, were being uplifted from ignorance and superstition. It was a rationale that cloaked brutality in righteousness and would become one of the central moral contradictions of European imperialism. And yet Henry remained a complex figure. He did not revel in cruelty, nor did he seek conquest for its own sake. His interest was always in knowledge, in the unlocking of the world. He read the logs of his captains with the same reverence others reserved for scripture. He demanded precise accounts, locations of river mouths, seasonal weather changes, migratory patterns of birds. He commissioned new instruments, sponsored astronomers, encouraged translations of Arabic treatises on geography. He believed that understanding the earth was akin to understanding the divine, that each discovery was a step toward the complete comprehension of God's creation. But there were losses too. Ships disappeared. Men died. Entire expeditions failed to return, swallowed by reefs or lost in storms that no astrolabe could predict. One such disaster in 1453 shook Henry deeply. A fleet sent to explore farther south along the coast of Guinea vanished without a trace. Weeks turned to months. No wreckage, no survivors, only silence. Among the missing were men Henry had personally trained, advised, even dined with. Their absence hung over Sagres like a pall. For a time, Henry grew quiet. His walks along the cliffs became longer. His gaze, once filled with vision, now carried the weight of mortality. But vision was not so easily extinguished. In the wake of the tragedy, Henry doubled his efforts. He reviewed every record, every map, every weather report. He consulted scholars in Coimbra, sent messengers to Italian city-states seeking updates on Ottoman naval movements, and increased the training regimen at Sagres. He commissioned the construction of sturdier vessels adapted to withstand the rigors of longer voyages. Above all, he began to instill in his protégés a new creed, not just of ambition, but of endurance. The next wave of expeditions bore the mark of this new determination. Álvaro Fernandez, a daring captain under Henry's command, pushed farther south than any previous voyage, reaching lands beyond the Gambia River and returning with tales of vast inland populations and greater navigable rivers. Though his ship was attacked and he barely escaped with his life, the journey confirmed that the coast did not end. It continued, twisting and branching like a thread leading to an unseen door. And Henry knew the door would open. In the broader world, change was accelerating. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 had sent shockwaves through Christendom. Trade routes once open through Byzantium were now subject to Islamic control. Italian merchants raised their prices. Spices became scarcer and more valuable. And European powers began to realize that whoever found a new route to the east would hold the keys to wealth and influence beyond comprehension. Portugal, once a peripheral kingdom, was now at the center of this race. Not because of its armies, but because of the vision of one man. Henry's influence grew accordingly. He was consulted not only on navigation, but on matters of diplomacy, trade policy, even ecclesiastical affairs. He remained unmarried, childless, focused. He continued to live simply at Sagres, rarely attending court, maintaining only what he needed to conduct his work. Visitors to his residence often remarked on the absence of luxury. No gold, no silks, only maps, books, and instruments. His time was divided between correspondence, instruction, and planning. He spoke little of himself, preferring to listen to others, to chart the future through the voices of those who had seen its first outlines. And yet he was aware that his time was finite. He had seen too many men die young to believe himself exempt. In his final years, Henry began to dictate his thoughts, committing to parchment not only the technical observations of his journeys, but the philosophy that had guided them. He wrote of the ocean as a mirror, reflecting both the divine and the human. He spoke of the duty of kings to expand not only their borders, but the boundaries of what their people understood. He described exploration as a sacred calling, a merging of faith and reason, of the seen and unseen. In 1460, as the Atlantic winds turned cool with autumn, Henry fell ill. He did not panic. He arranged his affairs, ordered the completion of several outstanding charts, and gave final instructions to his captains. He asked that his body be buried not in Sagres, but in the monastery of Batalha, beside his royal parents, as a reminder that the journey he had begun was part of a longer lineage, one that stretched backward to the defense of the realm and forward to the conquest of the world. He died quietly, without fanfare, at the age of 66. There was no great funeral, no public procession. Only later, as the full impact of his work began to unfold, would his name take on mythic stature. Within a generation, Portuguese ships would round the Cape of Good Hope. Within 2 generations, they would reach India. And with every voyage, every chart, every colony, the shadow of Henry would lengthen. He had not discovered new worlds himself, but he had made their discovery inevitable. Gold, God, and glory, 3 pillars of an age, 3 truths Henry never separated. In his hands, they became instruments not of division, but of purpose. And as the sails of Portugal unfurled across the globe, the legacy of the man who had stayed ashore but dreamed further than any mariner before him was carried on every tide. As the winds of 1460 swept across the cliffs of Sagres, Henry the Navigator stood in the twilight of his years, a solitary figure silhouetted against the Atlantic he had spent a lifetime confronting. His body had begun to fail him. The sharpness in his stride dulled, the steadiness in his hands betrayed by tremors. but his mind remained fixated on the unfinished edges of the world. He had built the machinery of exploration, the ships, the instruments, the maps, the methods. Yet the world he had envisioned, fully charted, interconnected, navigable, remained just out of reach. And with the horizon still unconquered, the Infante began to face a different kind of storm, the disintegration of his power, the corrosion of his reputation, and the creeping doubt that perhaps his grand design had been an illusion. In the years leading to his death, Henry's influence at court began to wane. The younger generation of nobles, raised not under the shadow of Ceuta but amid the allure of commerce and territorial control, grew impatient with the slow, costly progress of his expeditions. They no longer revered exploration for its own sake. Instead, they sought profits that could be measured in bales of spice, bars of gold, or consignments of human lives. Henry's philosophical justifications, steeped in evangelism and scientific curiosity, began to sound like relics of a nobler but less practical age. Worse, some at court began to accuse him of mismanagement. The African campaigns, though groundbreaking, had produced uneven results. The maps were beautiful. Yes, but what of the actual dominion over those coasts? Where were the cities founded, the territories claimed, the indigenous kings converted to Christendom? To the ambitious nobles eyeing Castile, Aragon, or North Africa for potential conquests, Henry's world of maps and instruments seemed increasingly abstract. There were even whispers that his continued insistence on secrecy regarding discoveries, his refusal to publicly release navigational knowledge, was not a strategy, but an egoistic need to control the narrative of exploration. They questioned whether the Infante had become less a navigator and more a gatekeeper of illusion. Compounding the situation was the cooling relationship between Henry and the young King Afonso V, his nephew. The boy who had once idolized his uncle had grown into a ruler in his own right, and one increasingly frustrated by Henry's independence. Though Afonso respected the legacy of his father Duarte and the early victories that had made the House of Avish strong, he saw little value in Henry's persistent focus on distant coasts and unseen lands. His gaze was drawn eastward, toward Castile, toward marriage alliances, toward Mediterranean politics. Africa, in his estimation, could wait. The result was a slow marginalization. Royal funding for Henry's projects was reduced. His captains were passed over for key positions. He was excluded from important policy discussions. At court, his name was spoken less often, and when it was accompanied by questions of relevance. The great Infante of 20 years ago had become a solitary figure on the periphery, admired by historians and scholars but increasingly ignored by the wielders of real power. Henry felt the shift acutely. He had never sought the throne, had never craved the political power of kings, but he had always believed that knowledge was power, and now, even that seemed to be slipping from his grasp. He poured himself into the minutiae of navigation, recalculating distances based on new lunar tables, refining wind pattern theories, compiling linguistic glossaries from returning crews. He worked longer hours as if to outrun the clock, but even his most trusted aides began to notice the toll it was taking. His once booming voice grew hoarse. His eyes strained against the candlelight. He spoke of voyages still to come as if they were already memories. And then came the blow that would shake his foundations. The expedition to Guinea, launched in 1458 under the command of a favored captain, returned not in triumph but in disgrace. The fleet had been scattered by storms. One ship had sunk entirely. Those that survived returned with little to show. No gold, no new discoveries, only a handful of captives and tales of hostile shores. Lisbon, already skeptical, erupted in criticism. The King's Council demanded an accounting of funds. Merchants withdrew investments. Even the church, once a stalwart supporter, grew wary. Henry offered no public defense. He issued no proclamations, mounted no rebuttals. Instead, he returned to Sagres, retreating deeper into his enclave of instruments and maps. Those who visited him in those years found a man increasingly isolated, not bitter, but exhausted. He no longer sought to convince others of his vision. He had become a custodian of it, preserving it in notebooks and diagrams, waiting for a future generation to pick up the torch. But in solitude, doubt crept in. He questioned the worth of his sacrifice. He had never married, had no heir. He had given his entire fortune and more to a cause that now seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He wondered whether his vision of a connected world had been naive, whether humanity would ever prioritize understanding over profit, communion over conquest. In the quiet hours before dawn, he paced the battlements, looking not at the sea, but at the land behind him, the Portugal that had changed without him. And yet, even as he wrestled with doubt, the legacy of his work began to assert itself in quiet but undeniable ways. Younger sailors, trained under his systems, began achieving results. Portuguese expeditions reached as far south as modern-day Sierra Leone. The navigational tools developed at Sagres were being adopted by captains across Europe. Italian merchants in Genoa and Venice took notice, recognizing that a new maritime power was emerging on the western edge of the continent. Foreign ambassadors requested audiences. Scholars wrote letters asking for access to his archives. The Vatican inquired about recent baptisms along the African coast. The very institutions that had once doubted him now turned their eyes toward his fading light, realizing too late, perhaps, that his vision had always been ahead of its time. Henry did not celebrate these vindications. He took them in with the same quiet composure that had defined his youth. He knew now that legacy was not forged in applause, but in endurance. He had weathered storms more violent than any at sea, the scorn of court, the loss of comrades, the erasure of his name from the annals of political influence. Yet the map had grown. The world had expanded. And somewhere, just beyond reach, the route to the east waited. In his final weeks, Henry became increasingly contemplative. He spent less time drafting plans and more time dictating reflections. He spoke of the stars and how they could be trusted more than kings. He described the ocean not as a wilderness, but as a canvas, waiting for those brave enough to draw upon it. He left no manifesto, no final declaration, only a series of observations, fragments of thought, and an unspoken question that lingered in the margins of his writings. What will they do with what I have given them? When he died in November 1460, the event passed with little fanfare. There were no public eulogies, no grand ceremonies. He was buried, as he wished, alongside his family in Batalha Monastery. The court barely acknowledged his passing. Portugal was turning its gaze inward once more toward dynastic alliances, toward Iberian rivalries, toward matters of land rather than sea. But even as the court turned its back, the ocean remembered. The ships he had helped design still floated in their harbors. The captains he had trained still consulted his charts. The maps bearing his influence were copied and carried to Italy, to France, to England, and within 2 generations, the name of Henry the Navigator would be spoken with reverence across continents. Not as a conqueror, not as a king, but as something rarer, a man who believed in the world before the world believed in itself. In the shadow of his absence, the waves continued to crash against the cliffs of Sagres, as they always had. But now, beneath those waves, lay new routes, new knowledge, new possibilities. And in the salt and wind, his legacy endured, not in glory won, but in glory made possible. In the silence that followed Henry's death, Portugal did not stop. The ships did not anchor in mourning. The wind did not pause for reflection. The waves, restless and unfeeling, continued their ancient rhythm, crashing against the jagged shores of Sagres, as if unaware that the man who had dared to ask what lay beyond them was gone. But somewhere within that relentless tide, something had changed. The quiet persistence of his vision, once ridiculed, ignored, or misunderstood, began to echo across the horizon, taking root in the minds of those who remained. First, the momentum was slow. The royal court, now firmly under the rule of King Afonso V, did not fully grasp the scale of what Henry had built. His death had been marked with formality but not reverence. The captains who had sailed under his command were dispersed, some dead, others old or retired. The maps he had financed and the instruments he had helped refine lay in dusty storerooms. For a moment, it seemed as though the age of discovery had reached its terminal point. Another nobleman's dream, buried alongside his bones. And yet, Henry's absence created space. Without his imposing intellect and meticulous control, a new generation of navigators emerged, freer in their ambitions, bolder in their pursuits, but still operating within the structure he had forged. The knowledge accumulated in Sagres did not die with him. It was inherited, adapted, and most crucially, acted upon. Portugal was no longer groping blindly along the African coast, it had become a nation of mariners with purpose. In 1462, just 2 years after Henry's death, Portuguese explorers returned to the region of Guinea with renewed vigor. This time, they came not only with the desire to map and trade but with the support of a monarchy beginning to recognize the value of maritime expansion. Expeditions grew larger, better financed, and more strategically organized. Coastal settlements were established, primitive at first, mere outposts of trade, but they formed the embryonic structure of an emerging empire. What had begun as Henry's personal vision was rapidly becoming state policy. One of the key figures in this transition was Fernão Gomes, a wealthy Lisbon merchant granted a monopoly on exploration and trade along the West African coast by King Afonso. Unlike Henry, Gomes was not driven by celestial charts or theological aspirations. He was a pragmatist. He sought return on investment, but he inherited the fruits of Henry's labors, his routes, his knowledge, his methods, and used them to push farther than any Portuguese ship had gone before. Under his license, captains like Pedro de Sintra and João de Santrum sailed to Sierra Leone, the Bight of Benin, and eventually reached the equator itself. These voyages confirmed what Henry had long believed but had never lived to see, that the African coast continued, uninterrupted, that the ocean did not end, and that beyond each promontory was another waiting to be named. The rumors Henry had collected of river systems, gold-rich cities, powerful African polities were being confirmed in detail. And with each new discovery, the foundations of Portuguese imperialism grew stronger. Commerce flourished. Gold flowed steadily into Lisbon, stamped into coins bearing the armillary sphere that would become the symbol of Portugal's maritime future. Ivory carvings, exotic birds, spices, and textiles began appearing in European markets. And with them came captives, human beings stripped of their names and histories, sold into a system that was no longer incidental but institutional. The slave trade, once justified under the pretense of religious conversion, had become a pillar of the Atlantic economy. Henry, had he lived, might have expressed horror or resignation. Perhaps he would have spoken of salvation and faith, of order and moral duty. But the empire that grew from his blueprint had outpaced his ethics. The instruments of navigation he had refined were now being used not just to discover, but to dominate. Still, his legacy remained embedded in every mast that crossed the Atlantic swell. The discipline of his training, the precision of his mapping, the intellectual rigor of his Sagres enclave, these formed the skeleton upon which the flesh of empire was draped. Even as explorers no longer invoked his name with reverence, they followed his paths, consulted his charts, and inherited the architecture of a vision that was never about one man, but about changing the way the world was seen. In Rome, the papacy took notice. Pope Sixtus IV issued bulls reinforcing Portugal's exclusive rights over lands discovered along the African coast, building upon earlier papal endorsements Henry had secured in his lifetime. These declarations formalized what had been Henry's lifelong ambition, to position Portugal as the vanguard of Christian expansion by sea. The theological veneer remained intact, even as the practice shifted inexorably toward economic conquest. At home, the monarchy began investing more directly in exploration. Afonso V, once dismissive of his uncle's eccentric obsessions, now embraced the strategic advantages of maritime supremacy. He sponsored new shipbuilding initiatives, reformed port infrastructure, and established regulatory systems for overseas trade. The court, once skeptical, now found itself reshaped by Henry's absence. The language of maps, stars, and wind patterns became a central element of royal policy. And then came Bartholomew Dias. Though still decades away, his voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 would fulfill the route Henry had imagined all his life. Dias's success would not have been possible without the decades of groundwork laid by Henry and his successors. The records, the knowledge of Atlantic wind systems, the design of the caravels, none of it emerged spontaneously. It was the culmination of a long, painstaking process Henry had begun with pencil, compass, and prayer. The echo of Henry's influence was not limited to Portugal. Other European powers took note of the kingdom's maritime success. Spain, France, and eventually England began investing in their own explorations. Genoese and Venetian cartographers consulted Portuguese maps, The printing press, still young in Europe, spread navigational knowledge faster than ever before. What had once been a secretive endeavor became a continental fever. The world, it seemed, had opened. But while others sought fame and fortune, the DNA of Henry's mission retained a quieter, more enduring element: method. He had approached the sea not as a mystery to be feared, but as a problem to be solved. He had believed that human reason, when applied with discipline and courage, could unravel the vastest of uncertainties. That spirit, the analytical resolve, the patient accumulation of knowledge, became the hallmark of Portuguese navigation and, later, of scientific discovery across Europe. Even the enemies of Portugal came to respect this tradition. Ottoman admirals consulted captured Portuguese maps. Arab traders adjusted their routes. African rulers, long isolated from the whims of European dynasties, now negotiated with emissaries carrying letters and gifts from kings they would never meet. The world Henry had dreamed of, a world interconnected not by myth but by contact, had come to life. And yet, with every new line drawn on the map, something else was erased. Local histories, oral traditions, and regional sovereignties were overwritten by Portuguese names and European categorizations. The exploration Henry had framed as a divine calling evolved into a machinery of subjugation. Ports became forts. Trade became extraction. Faith became justification. And the maps, once tools of wonder, became instruments of control. But history, like the sea, is never one thing. It does not offer simple legacies. Henry the Navigator was not a saint, nor a villain. He was a man of his time, devout, brilliant, flawed, who dared to ask a question no one else had the courage to pursue: what lies beyond? And in that question he changed the world. Even now, centuries later, satellites trace the same wind patterns his captains once recorded. Merchant ships cross oceans along routes first sketched by his cartographers. Modern global commerce, international diplomacy, and cultural exchange all rest on the foundations laid in part by a quiet prince who stood on a cliff and listened to the horizon. His name may be carved in stone in Lisbon, inscribed in textbooks and cast in bronze, but his true monument is motion, the ceaseless flow of discovery he helped set in motion. The currents that carry ships, the stars that guide pilots, the maps that chart futures, they all carry the echo of his voice, calling forward, ever forward, across the sea. In the final years of his life, Henry the Navigator retreated deeper into himself than he ever had into the unknown coasts of Africa. The man who had once commanded fleets and orchestrated expeditions now lived in a world reduced to shadows and memory, where the tide no longer brought reports of distant rivers but only the steady beat of his own declining heart. His body, once lean and precise like the compass needles he favored, began to betray him. His legs stiffened. His hands lost their surety. His eyes, so long trained to study the stars, dimmed against the candlelight of his work table. The fortress at Sagres, once a hive of thought and ambition, had grown quiet. The students and scholars who had once filled its corridors with questions and ideas had moved on, some to command ships, others to serve in court. A few lost to storms or skirmishes on foreign shores. Those who remained did so out of loyalty more than ambition, caring for the aging prince whose vision had once lit the sea itself. The great maps were still there, pinned to the walls, their parchment yellowed at the edges, their coastlines fuller than ever but still incomplete. Africa's contours now stretched farther than Henry had imagined in his youth, but the tip, the long-sought passage to the Indian Ocean, remained unseen. He would not live to witness it. He knew that. Each day he awoke earlier and retired sooner. He dictated letters to distant captains, though fewer replied now. He edited the margins of old manuscripts, correcting wind directions, annotating latitudes, refining terminology. He spoke less in bold declarations and more in soft recollections. Where once he had discussed the ocean as a conquest, he now described it as a teacher, indifferent but consistent, brutal yet honest. He had come to realize that no man truly commands the sea. At best, he is allowed to move through it for a while, to learn from it and to leave behind a line on a chart, a name on a map, a rumor of passage. He spent hours in the chapel overlooking the water, not in prayer for strength, but in reflection. Faith had always guided him, but in his last years it had become less about divine favor and more about divine order. He no longer saw himself as a crusader or instrument of providence. He saw himself as a thread in a larger tapestry, a small part of an unfolding plan that reached beyond crowns and charts. He had not brought salvation to the heathens of Africa, nor had he reclaimed Jerusalem for Christendom. But he had opened doors through which others would walk, for better or worse. There were regrets. He never said them aloud, but they hovered behind his eyes when he looked at the ledger of names. Captains lost, crews unaccounted for, families never notified. He regretted the secrecy, the obsession with control. He had once hoarded knowledge like a miser hoards gold, believing that Portugal's supremacy required ignorance elsewhere. But in the end, he understood that discovery was not a possession. It was a current that moved with or without permission, and he had no illusions about the slave trade. He had rationalized it in theological terms, cloaked it in language of salvation and duty. But the faces of the captives returned in his dreams. Children torn from river villages, mothers sold beside their sons. The screams had faded in his mind, but the silence they left behind had grown louder. He wrote fewer letters to the king. Afonso V, though more receptive now to maritime policy, remained distant. Their relationship had been formal, strained by power and expectation. Henry never sought to rule but had wielded influence like a blade, clean, effective, unquestioned. Yet that influence had waned long before his health. The younger generation of nobles respected his legacy but no longer consulted his counsel. They believed in ships and guns, in forts and flags, in domination without hesitation. Henry had started this journey believing knowledge would lead to unity. But unity, he realized too late, had not been the goal of those who came after him. Still, he found comfort in small things. The daily movement of the sun across his table, the wind brushing his study walls, unchanged through the decades, the creak of wooden floors beneath his steps. He found peace in order, in tides that rose on schedule, in stars that circled with divine precision. He had tried to mirror that order in his own life, to shape the chaos of human ambition into a straight line of progress. And perhaps he had succeeded, just not in the way he had envisioned. In his final winter, Henry grew increasingly withdrawn. Visitors were turned away politely. He walked less. He spoke only when necessary. His last surviving maps, unfinished and delicate, remained spread across his workbench, weighted by stones and old compass casings. He would stare at them for hours, tracing imagined routes with his trembling finger, murmuring distances and bearings as if still commanding a voyage. He refused to be moved from Sagres. To die elsewhere would be a betrayal of everything he had built. When the illness came, it came quietly. A chill that lingered, a cough that deepened, fevers that did not break. He refused the rites at first, insisting that the work must continue, that the final calculations needed correcting. He dictated amendments from his bed, correcting a misprinted longitude, arguing over wind direction in a logbook from 1448. But his voice faltered, then faded until even those closest to him could no longer hear its sharp conviction. Only the ocean remained constant, roaring just outside his window, patient and eternal. He died in November 1460, as the winds shifted toward the Atlantic, the sails in Lagos harbor tugging gently against their moorings. His body was transported, per his wishes, to the monastery of Batalha, where he was laid to rest among the kings and queens of the Avis dynasty. There was no state funeral, no parade. He left no heir, no crown, no throne. But in the weeks that followed, the captains who had once served under him gathered in taverns and halls, retelling the stories, the battles of Ceuta, the first caravels, the laughter in Sagres when the world still felt new and vast. They drank not in sorrow but in recognition that something had shifted with his passing. The last light of an age had gone out, but the dawn of another had begun. And beyond Portugal, the world kept moving. Ships continued to leave port. New coasts were discovered. Rivers were charted. And in time, the path around Africa to India would be found. Henry had never seen it, but he had believed in it so fervently, so stubbornly, that his belief had reshaped reality. His life had been a voyage within as much as without, a search not just for new lands, but for purpose, order and truth in a world shaped by wind, water, and will. He had not reached the end of the map, but he had changed the direction of the compass. Long after Henry the Navigator had breathed his last, the wind that had once tousled his cloak on the cliffs of Sagres continued to sweep across oceans. It carried with it not only the sails of caravels and the scent of foreign lands, but the weight of an idea that had changed the course of human history. It was the idea that the world was not bounded by fear, but by ignorance, and that ignorance, through discipline and daring, could be conquered. In the years that followed his death, Portugal did what Henry had always believed it could. Under the command of Bartolomeu Dias, a Portuguese fleet rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, Cape of Good Hope. It was called, proving definitively that the continent could be circumnavigated, and that the fabled sea route to the east was not myth but reality. It was a feat Henry had envisioned but never witnessed, and it vindicated decades of preparation, investment, and belief. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the voyage to India. The trade routes that Henry had traced with trembling fingers on parchment now stretched across the globe, carrying not only cargo but culture, faith, and empire. The world changed at a speed no one had anticipated. The age of discovery, seated in Henry's quiet fortress at the edge of Europe, became the engine of European dominance. Empires emerged, overlapping and colliding across oceans. The Americas were unveiled to European eyes. Africa, once distant and unknowable, was carved into maps and absorbed into markets. Asia, with its spices, silks, and philosophies, was drawn into the economic and political orbit of the West. The planet had begun to shrink, not physically but imaginatively. Distance no longer equaled mystery. What had been beyond reach was now within grasp. And yet, with that shrinking came shadows. The maps Henry helped inspire became tools of conquest. The sea lanes he charted became arteries of exploitation. The knowledge he so carefully curated was used not only to explore, but to subjugate. The slave trade that had begun under his watch exploded into a transatlantic atrocity, a centuries-long wound that would scar generations. Cultures were displaced. Languages were silenced. Civilizations were broken, rearranged, or erased. Henry himself was remembered differently across time. To some, he became a hero of progress, a man of reason who pulled Europe from the medieval fog into the clarity of global awareness. To others, he was the architect of imperial cruelty, the quiet engineer of systems that would later be used to justify violence and greed under banners of faith and science. His legacy became a mirror reflecting not just the man, but the gaze of those who looked upon him. In Portugal, his name was etched into stone and history books. Statues rose in Lisbon and Porto. Streets, schools, and institutions bore his name. His body, entombed in Batalha Monastery, lay among kings, but his memory drifted far beyond royal lineage. He was not revered for the wars he won. His sword had long since rusted, but for the questions he asked, the boundaries he refused to accept, the doors he opened for others to walk through. Modern historians debated his motivations. Was he a visionary or a pragmatist? A scientist or a zealot? Did he truly believe in the unity of humanity through exploration? Or did he mask ambition in the language of salvation? The truth, as it so often is, lay somewhere in between. Henry was a man of contradictions, both devout and calculating, generous and secretive, humble in lifestyle but grand in ambition. He was shaped by his time, but he shaped it in return. His fortress at Sagres crumbled slowly, weathered by centuries of wind and war, but its symbolic foundations held. It was there that the idea of maritime empire was born, not through conquest, but through curiosity. That idea outlived the fort, the prince, and even the empire itself. It lived on in shipyards, in navigational academies, in satellite trajectories, in the way modern nations conceived of space and borders. The globe, once a patchwork of disconnected myths, became a unified sphere of interaction. Thanks in part to the compasses Henry calibrated and the maps he commissioned. Even in the realm of thought, his influence lingered. The scientific method reliant on observation, recording, testing, echoed the processes Henry had insisted upon in his training of captains. The Age of Enlightenment, with its emphasis on discovery and classification, had roots in the meticulous charting of coasts and stars begun by his hand. He did not live to see the modern world, but his fingerprints were on its construction. He remains in the minds of many, a transitional figure standing with one foot in the medieval age and the other in the modern world. He believed in God's order but sought it through measurement. He dreamed of heaven but invested in hulls and harbors. He spoke of salvation while trading in human flesh. He was neither saint nor monster, but a man flawed, brilliant, determined who could see farther than most. Today, when we track storms from satellites or navigate continents with the touch of a screen, we rarely think of Henry. When cargo ships traverse the globe in weeks, when cultures blend through air travel and digital connections, we do not pause to consider the prince who once stood at the edge of the known world and asked what might lie beyond. But if we could listen closely, beyond the digital noise and modern urgency, we might still hear it, the wind rising off the Atlantic, the waves beating the stone, the distant echo of a voice that never sailed yet moved the world. It is there, in the silence between stars, in the space between shores, that Henry lives on. Not in monuments or medals, but in the restlessness that drives humanity to reach farther, to question deeper, to sail into uncertainty with nothing but belief and a compass. He charted the wind, and the world followed.